There it is.
There it is. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Unfollowing Mum. As you probably already guessed, I have a guest with me this week, and I am super excited to speak to her. This is someone that I have bonded with over Instagram. As we've just said, trauma bonded. We've trauma bonded over Instagram, not just from our shitty experience with parents, but also when we've been talking about things like PMDD and just, general life. And I'm so pleased that I have met her. This is Elspeth Van Der Hole, and we've just had a conversation about asking for names, so she's giving me the thumbs up in the background, like, yeah, you said it right. So I would like to introduce her and just tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello. Okay, so firstly, thank you so much for having me on. And like you said, even though the main topic of this is around estrangement, our lives sort of really interlink so deeply over so many different levels. So to give you a little bit about me, I am a fitness coach, I'm a photographer, I'm an illustrator, but I'm just me. And I think that is important for me to say, because I've spent so much of my life placing value on what I do that even then I instinctively introduce myself by my professions rather than just being me first.
Yeah. Do you know, I do that as well. And I also will lead with, like, I'm a mum of 3. I'm always just a bit like,
I'm like, why do I give my stats before everything? I'm just like,
these are the things about me, but how else do you introduce yourself, really?
It's a really interesting thing that I've been observing in myself mainly recently, how I introduce myself to people, because I've realized that a lot of it is based on my childhood and my upbringing, and that desperate need for validation and acceptance in what I do, because there was so much deep emphasis. And I think we're the same age, I think, aren't we? I'm 33.
34.
I'm nearly 30. Yeah,
just
nearly
tipped. Yeah, I was in January. Just tipped you to it.
Oh yeah, we're both 89 babies.
Yeah.
So I think that's where probably also why we overlay so much in terms of our experiences, because I think our upbringing was never around discovering who you are or finding happiness. It was getting the best grades, it was being at the best school, it was having a good reputation, it was never speaking about the family outside of the unit, it was stiff upper lip, it was place your value on what you do, what you achieve, and how you represent the family as a whole. There was never really anything about just you.
Us. Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it was less about the good grades. There was definitely that being at the good school so that my mum could be like, oh, yes, my daughter's here. Weird, which I look now. And when my parents separated, my mum could no longer afford to send me to private school, but she ploughed herself into so much debt to try and keep me there, and then put such negative connotations on me having to leave, that not only did it deeply damage the way I felt about my new school when I eventually did have to leave, I was terrified to go to that new school, but it also really damaged my relationship with my dad, because he was the one that wasn't paying child support. All of these different things, all centered around just basically being able to keep up the Joneses. It was never, and it was always held over me as, I gave you the best education and I did this for you. And you know, when you're just like, I didn't want it. I didn't ask for that. You chose that, and it made our lives so much harder. It was always a bit more about keeping up with the Joneses and a bit less about the grades and things, but also down to, like, I was almost like a parrot. I was raised to kind of just parrot her opinions, parrot her beliefs. And if I stepped back from that, I was like, I don't agree with you. Like, that homophobic shish you're coming out with, that's not how I feel. Or that actually, mum is really weird. When I started challenging that as a young adult, that was when the problems really started for me, because it was like, it was weird to challenge it. How dare you challenge? You are just a mini me.
Yep. I had exactly the same. And it's so funny because, just to caveat this, we have never spoken about this before this podcast, and your experience there is exactly the same as mine. So I went to 7 schools altogether, and the first one was a private school. And then I went there from when I was like 2.5. And in hindsight, that's probably because they just wanted to also get rid of me for a bit. And because it was full school from 2.5, it wasn't like nursery. It was like, I remember having like a full PE kit and a blazer and all this stuff. Like I was 2.5, like, and then I went to another couple of schools after that were state schools. And then there was one school in particular that I went to where actually, so altogether I've been to 3 private schools and 4 state schools. Each of the private schools, I don't know necessarily about the first one, but definitely the second 2, I was removed because we couldn't afford it. And so and that wasn't in the way that my parents made that decision. That was because the schools actively kept saying, you're not paying the fees, this child can't come in. So the first school I remember being at, I was only about 7 or 8. We had to have everything from indoor shoes, outdoor shoes, pumps, wellies, trainers. We would have to wear pumps and overalls to set up for lunch. You would have to eat perfectly and eat everything. I remember getting screamed at by a teacher for not holding my spoon right at the age of 7. And we had a teacher at the end of every single table, and you would have to eat everything on your plate. And if you didn't, you'd be shouted at. And at the end of every lunch, you would get allocated an item. And I will always remember the fact that forks are called fourchettes in French, because it would be shouted in French and then you'd have to take it up. And I think back and I'm like, that was a 7-year-old child, right? And so that doesn't sound awful, that whatever, it was a bit weird, but the stressful thing was every single morning I remember I would come up to the school gates and you'd be in your black outdoor shoes, getting ready to change into your brown indoor shoes. And I would be sick on the pavement every single morning and have to be dragged into that school. They decided it was because I wasn't eating breakfast in the mornings. So they forced my mum to bring me in half an hour early every morning. And I would sit in the canteen bit, in like the kitchens with the dinner ladies. And they would essentially force feed me Marmite on toast. And they decided that was appropriate and for a 7/8-year-old child, when actually what was happening was I was being emotionally abandoned at home, and my sister was in the senior school and she behaved fairly precociously and she had a bad reputation, and I was known as, insert name here, as sister, and so I gained her reputation. So the teachers hated me, my mum didn't particularly like me and didn't want to support me emotionally, and I was just being told it was because I wasn't eating breakfast. And now I look back and I'm like, that small child had crippling anxiety and was very sad and just needed a lot of love. And it blew my mind when I think back to these moments with the adult brain I have now. That child just needed love.
Do you know what's really weird?
What?
We've never talked about this before, but
I feel like we're about to have a spiritual experience together today.
Grab your crystals. I went to when I was little, my private primary school was like a very tiny village school. By the time it shut down, there was 30 kids there, and I was so happy there. But it shut down as I was about to go into year 6, when I was like halfway through year 5. So I had to go to another school in the interim before I could go to this secondary school that was hailed as like the be all and end all. And I did love it at that secondary school. It was called the Mount in York. And I loved it there. I had a wonderful experience there for the 18 months that my mum could pay off credit cards, pay it off using credit cards and that kind of thing, until I had to leave because we couldn't afford it. This interim school that I had to go to, I despised it. And looking back, there's lots of reasons I despised it. But with you saying you threw up every single morning, I cried every single day, to the point where eventually it was almost forced upon my mum to take me to see a therapist because they couldn't work out why. And she sat in that room with me with that therapist, and you could see the therapist. Now, knowing what I know, the therapist actually gave me tools that you use to work with CPTSD. So, you know, where they teach you to find a safe space in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it would be like sitting in a waterfall area. I was 9.
Wow.
I was 9. And that therapist was telling me how to do these things and how to try and control my breathing. And knowing what I know now, it was trauma, and it was all surrounding huge anxiety because I didn't want to be in this place. And like you say, emotionally abandoned, or being treated at home as the stand-in spouse, the stand-in therapist, the best friend, which really drives me bonkers. And when I think about cycles repeating, there is a very small local Montessori that is like a nursery preschool, and we sent our kids there because it was deemed to be the best in the area, and we thought it was amazing. And Ruben had a really negative experience there, my eldest. He kept saying he hated it, but he could never really verbalize why. And he was only maybe 3 or 4, because this was a preschool, but he'd go in 2 to 3 times a week just to try and help him get a bit socialized. And knowing what I know now, not sure that was necessary, but we thought it was the right thing at the time. And then somebody said to me, they pulled me aside and they were like, I wanted you to know I witnessed something with Ruben today. He dropped something because they had to pour their own cereal and get their own breakfasts, get their own lunches, that kind of thing. Which again, it's a little bit odd, but it's not. It's encouraging them to do things for themselves, and that's very much Montessori philosophy. And I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with that. But he dropped something and he'd spilt some milk, and this mum, who didn't take her daughter out, which baffled me, pulled me aside and said, look, I witnessed something today. Ruben was screamed at so much, and that's not the first time I've seen him being shouted at, but also he, the other day, was wet and nobody changed him.
Oh, and that breaks my heart.
He was out by the end of the week. Toby, who absolutely loved the nursery portion of it, were out by the end of the week, and they never set foot there again. The difference between my reaction as a mother and our reaction as parents, finally realizing, oh my God, that's what's wrong. That's why it's not just because we're being told as brand new parents, he's a clingy toddler. He doesn't like it there because he's frightened there.
Yeah. But
so
also,
he will
there's
not
generally a
be going
reason.
there.
There's generally a reason why a child is clingy. You don't just, obviously, I'm not a mother myself, but I'm basing it on my own behaviors as a child. Like I look back and I'm able to understand why I behaved certain ways. I didn't have the vocabulary to express myself the way I do now, so it would come out in physical behaviors. And so even things like, I remember there would be a total distinction between my brother and me and the way we both behaved in terms of when we were overwhelmed. So in terms of the narrative that was put on it. So I used to bash my head off things when I was really overwhelmed. Like I would, oh my God, see?
So did I.
And this has also transcended into adulthood. Like I think the last time I did it was probably about a year or so ago. And I've had to work really hard not to do it and not to resort to that. But when I was a kid, it would almost be laughed about that I would have carpet burns on my forehead. And I distinctly remember the joke about Duplo bricks. Do you remember like big Duplo?
Yeah.
Apparently I used to smash my head off them and I'd have like Duplo circles on my forehead. And this would be laughed about as me being, what was the word? It was, if I quote, if Elspeth doesn't get her own way, she does this. However, and I used to hold my breath until I passed out. And I remember there was one time where I think I'd come round and I said to my parents, why did you wake me up? I was in a nice warm pink place. So that's weird, but anyway.
Worrying.
Yes. Also weird that I was quite happy to stay asleep.
Yeah.
And then
but is that not like, for a normal parent, that'd be such a big red flag for anybody who had that emotional connection? Like we were doing everything we could, and we were being told at the time, oh, you know, Ruben's possibly neurodivergent, you need to get him assessed. And we were doing everything we could possibly think of to work out why he wasn't enjoying the experience, but Toby was, what we could do. And as soon as this parent said, I remember we picked him up, and I called the school after we'd picked him up and said, neither of my kids are ever going to be coming back here. And that was it. That was the end of the conversation, because to find out that was the reason why you act on it. And yet we didn't have that.
Yeah, and that blows my mind, that I think now you and me are sort of exercising that autonomy over both ourselves, and I will with my future children in the same way you are with yours. I want to give them that voice and help them find an understanding of their voice. And just going back quickly to what I was saying before, the narrative that was put on my brother, and this is to highlight how I think you said it in a previous podcast, or we've spoken about it before, how we all have different parents, even if we have the same parents, because we're born into a different dynamic. So I have an older brother and an older sister. My sister's 7 years older than me, and my brother's 5 years older than me, and I was, quote, a surprise baby. And yeah, we all know what that means. And the way my brother's narrative was pushed around when he would hold his breath and pass out was that, oh, he would do it when he was in pain, poor little thing, like he's hurt himself, he's holding his breath. Whereas for me, it was, oh, that one's spoilt and selfish and difficult, and she's doing this to get attention. And it's like, oh my God, like, who's going to actually hold their breath until they pass out because they want attention? And also, I will say this to so many people, attention seeking is not a negative thing. If we reframe, when somebody wants food, could you imagine if we just went, they're just hunger seeking, I'm not giving them any food, how dare you hunger seek? Like, it just sounds ridiculous, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah, this is the way I've helped myself rationalize that, myself now and myself as a child, I am allowed to want attention. Attention isn't a bad thing. Like it's a human need. We all need it in some form or another. Whereas I need it in different ways. Sometimes I need attention from my partner in a loving way, or I need attention from a friend to feel like I have connection within society, or I need attention from my boss to reassure me that I'm doing well at work. Like, attention isn't a bad thing. It's a human need. And when we reframe it and we understand about hunger, like, if someone literally turned around to a child and just said, you're hunger seeking, how dare you, that there would be some kind of like social services involved there.
Yeah, it would be so bizarre. But when it's attention, it's attention's got such a negative connotation to it. But if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
love it.
Stability and care and nurturing, they're all in there at the very, very foundation of everything. And realistically, is attention not just a different word for those things? And yet we frame it in such a negative way. And, I've said it about my kids, because it is that thing that we are brought up believing, that if you're acting out a certain way, if you're doing a certain thing, it's for attention. But what you've got to look at is, why do they feel they need to do those things to get attention? What's happening here that they feel that they need to get attention? And that's when, for me as a parent, I will sit down with my kids and say, and my mum used to say to me, you are attention seeking, but you're going to get the wrong kind of attention. And that was very much done in a threatening way. Whereas I will sit down with my kids and say, hey, what's this about? This is coming off very much as, I want some kind of attention. What is it that you're needing right now? Because at the minute, the wrong attention's coming because I'm getting frustrated and cross. It's the same words. It's just a totally different way of parenting around them. And I think so often it's viewed that unless you are aggressive, or you are being threatening, or even to the extreme of hitting, you're not disciplining that child, or you're not explaining to them how they should be behaving or keeping them under control. When in reality, you're doing all of those things just by speaking to them.
I think when it comes to how we parent around attention seeking, it's so interesting, like you said, to understand what we are bringing to that interaction. And it's so easy to lose ourselves in that moment and just carry on the pattern of what our parents did. And interestingly, I was talking to somebody yesterday, and you probably know this already, but generational trauma and trauma, any trauma, is well, specifically generational, is transferred through our DNA.
Yes.
Yeah. So I thought you'd already know about this. So when sometimes we respond to things, and especially we haven't been taught how to be parents, so we think that we're going to go into being a parent as this like amazing person that's not like my mum, but ultimately I've never parented before. So realistically, when I have a child, even though I don't want to be like my mum, that was the only like example of parenting I was given firsthand. So I will probably resort to behaviors like hers. I just have to learn to catch it. And it's because I haven't had a chance to exercise that yet to undo that DNA. And so I think that's really important to note for anyone listening to this who is finding that they're speaking to their children in the same way that their toxic parent did, that's not your fault. That might be a subconscious behavior that you just need to take a second to, like you do, you go, right, okay, am I meeting this with the wrong kind of attention? What do I need to be meeting this with, and how do I need to give them a platform to communicate it, because they don't actually have the words. They don't know what they want. They don't know what to say. So I think that's really interesting to sort of see that you've said that you've met that with similar behaviors, because I think hearing that from a mother gives me reassurance that when I come to be a mother, because that's something I fear a lot, I fear that I will have children and that I will do the same thing to them, and that I won't be able to love them in the way that I need to. I actually had hypnotherapy a few years ago around trauma nightmares, and what they did was they went through something. Have you heard of personality fragmentation?
Yes. Yeah.
So he went through essentially working through where my trauma lay, in what years of my life it lay, and it literally was the majority of years. Shock.
Yeah.
Oh, newsflash. And obviously the first trauma showed up as quite literally me being born. And I had to visualize holding myself as a baby and giving myself the love that baby needed in that moment when it did not get the love it needed. And that shows that, like, your life is already off on a very stressful footing.
Yeah.
But I couldn't visualize the face of the baby that I was holding. It was like there was some massive block that wouldn't allow me to love that baby because I didn't know how to. And I had an extra session because we spent 2 hours and I just couldn't do it. So I had to come back the next week and we went through it. And eventually I managed to do it, and I managed to kind of get to this place of an understanding of love for this child version of me, which really helped me to see that in the future that I will be able to do that and I will be capable of doing it. But there was just so much deep fear. And you probably had that as well before you had a child, of how am I going to do this? Because if my own mother couldn't love me properly, is there a thing that means that it's just ingrained in you to not be able to love, rather than that you can learn to?
Yeah.
And I think you can learn to. I think that generation was just fairly screwed. But
I'm discovering that more and more. I think that generationally, it's, you can tell the difference when you're speaking to someone about what generation that they come from.
Yes.
Massively.
Yeah.
Massively.
And that's something I think I wanted to talk to you about as well, because I read something the other day about how I think it was, you can see the difference in millennials and Gen Zs, not because of the obvious, not because they're happy to wear low-rise jeans again, which is somewhere I'm never going back to.
No. Hard pass.
But it was a TikTok, and it was how millennials and Gen Zs show up differently in a hair salon. And millennials will walk in and will quietly close the door and will apologize for our existence as soon as we've arrived, and we'll say, oh no, don't worry, you do whatever you want to my hair, that's absolutely fine. They'll do a terrible haircut. You'll probably ask, I think it was for a money piece and a soft balayage, but which I think is the way you say it, and I can never get that word right. And you might have some gentle layers, and then they'll probably do it really badly, charge you 3 times the price that you should, but you'll still say thank you and love it and pretend to love it and leave quietly. And you'll get out of there and you'll make yourself as small as possible. And it was even down to stuff like you literally sit on your own coat and have your handbag under your legs to make sure you take up the least space. Yeah. Whereas, see,
that's so true.
Right. Whereas Gen Z walk in, they literally chuck their stuff on the floor. They throw their coat to someone who's standing nearby, and not in a sort of entitled way, just in a, we're allowed to do this, people are helping me, I'm allowed to get help way. And they get all like bouncy and excitable, and they take up space, and they bring snacks, and someone offers them a drink and they say yes. They don't say no, and they don't say, oh, are you sure? I'm sorry, I'm taking too much space up.
Yeah.
And the correlation was that boomer parenting taught us that we should never take up space and we should always apologize for our existence. And now Gen Zs are being brought up by millennials who are going, please take up space for us, like we need you to do it.
Yeah, no, and it's so true, because that's the big difference. I look at how I parent my kids versus how, and I think the one thing that I want to get across with this is that nobody's asking for perfection.
No, not
that you
at all. If
meant to
anything,
be,
please don't be perfect.
Yeah, don't be perfect. You are meant to make mistakes. You're a human being. And I read somewhere that parents only actually have to get it right 30 to 40% of the time.
Nice.
In order, like, come on, mum, I was asking for 30 fucking percent.
That's less than I needed to pass my degree.
Right. I mean, come on. What the hell were you doing? You'd got a bar that was on the floor, my guy. And I think if you put it in that perspective, less than half of the time you have to be getting it right in order to form a healthy connection, or a somewhat healthy connection, because it boils down to accountability and to reparation when things do go wrong. And it's all in how we repair it, because my God, things are going to go wrong. But I look at how I speak to my kids, and I look at how I encourage them. And my mum used to say to me, well, I've always encouraged you. I used to tell you you could be anything you wanted to be. And I'm like, yeah, you did, while simultaneously saying to me, all the money I wasted on your education. That was one of her favorite phrases. All the money I wasted on your education. And I'm like,
did we have the same mother?
Did we? Sibling?
Well, some of my family is from up north, so maybe.
Maybe. Hi, long lost. Honestly, I've found enough long lost siblings for this year. Thanks.
Yeah, no. Oh God, yeah. I was like, hang on, I've heard this. And she's not joking.
No, she's really not. My for anybody who hasn't listened to, I think it was episode 2 of the podcast, my dad's adopted daughter got in touch with me to tell me how disgraced she was that I was daring to speak ill of him. I'm like, look, honey, you enjoyed him for 3 years. I survived him for 16. I mean, we are not the same.
You can't make it up.
Very much indicative of what we've already been saying with how different parenting experiences can be for each individual. And with you saying about how things were different for your brother, even with the same parents, completely different experiences. And again, now we've got this new generation. And if you look at how, and I see it all the time on TikTok, because there's such a wide range of generations. I get a lot of boomer parents who will come to my content to be really angry, and who will see my post about estrangement and be like, you're so ungrateful, you owe your parents for this. I'm like, no, that's a debt mindset. Let's unpack that. Whereas Gen Z just walk in and be like, fuck off. How dare you? How dare you speak about that? I don't owe my parents shit. And I'm like,
I am learning so much from Gen Z, and also Gen Alpha, which is something I've only recently discovered that you'd already know about, because your kids must be Alpha, right?
Yeah, they are. And my gosh, they are. I saw something the other day that said, so millennials, well, Gen X have started the change.
Yeah, because it goes boomer, X, millennial, right?
Yes, it does. Yeah. And Gen X's have started the change, but they're totally forgotten, because the boomers are so busy focusing and warring with millennials, who have made these big jumps in changes. And then you come to Gen Z, who are much more interested in the environment, in this, in that, in social change. And they're making big changes, but they're not quite there yet. But by the time Gen Alpha comes in, my God, will we see? And they'd linked it back to history, and in how, if you look at history, these massive radical changes in society tend to happen every so few generations.
Wow.
So you'll have boomer, X, millennial, Z all starting to make change. And then that fifth one comes along in that 50-year cycle, and bang, there's this massive change. And I thought, you know what, actually, knowing what I know about history, that makes sense. And it's because we tend to go in cycles as humans, and we see what our parents did and go, I didn't like that. And that doesn't feel right. That doesn't feel good. How can I do that differently? And then we tweak things, and then our children look at us and go, oh, I don't like that either. How can I change that? But we're willing to sit behind them going, that's fair. I get why you didn't like that. I've made an error there. Let's talk that through. Whereas our parents would have just been deeply hurt that we dared to think they were anything less than perfect, when no one's perfect.
But this was the narrative, and that's kind of why I started in the way I did, where I caught myself, where I'm trying to stop doing that. I'm valuable via what I do, because there was such a heavy, deep emphasis on that perfection. And even, it's so interesting you said a second ago about I spent so much on your education, blah, 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 because I was simultaneously told by my mum, I remember the phrase, someone has to be the best at blah, 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 so why can't it be you? And I used to think that was a really reassuring, like, oh, she did support me in some things. She's told me I can be the best at this thing. And in hindsight, I've realized that was because she wanted me to be the best, so she could say my daughter is the best at X. And I remember after my dad died, in literally like the week after he died, she told me to hurry up and earn my millions so I could look after her. I was 23. I was really tired and trying to finish my degree, and my dad died. And I look back at these things, and I remember at the time the amount of people that met me with such disdain of, but she's your mother, how dare you do this? It's obvious, and it's because of their own fear that we as a human race cannot comprehend that a mother would be anything other than all encompassing, all loving, all perfect, rooting back to that mother nature, like caring, loving, wonderful human. And they cannot understand it, so therefore it is easier for the human brain to believe that the child is the problem.
Yes,
because we can accept that, like, as a thought process. Our brains allow us to have that with less discomfort. And so now I'm 10 years into estrangement. I don't give a shit if you want to tell me that, oh, but she's your mother. I'm going to say, all right, then where's she been for the last 10 years? Because if you want to play that game, I'll meet you in the middle. But also, I don't actually want her there. Like, I have grieved a mother that I didn't have. I don't grieve that one. Like, that one can stay there. That one made me really, really sad. And I'm really proud of 23-year-old me for identifying these patterns and going, even whilst in survival, like deep survival mode there, I had two choices. I either stayed in that unit, or I literally packed my bags and left the morning after my dad's funeral, and I never went back. And there was so much fear in me, but it was like my body knew that there would be more fear if I stayed. And even after that, I was told there was so much negativity around what I did. I remember I was in such like a deep hole afterwards that I would just sort of hover about on Twitter, just chatting shit, which we all did back then. And I remember, and I was like on benefits. I'd finished my degree. I was homeless and having to live with a friend's parents because I had no money and nowhere to go, and everything was awful. And I couldn't handle working, because every job I had, I'd end up quitting because I would get too overwhelmed and crumble and fall apart and then lose my job. And so I was doing my best to rebuild. And I remember there was one day I was watching This Morning, a classic, a midday TV, distract from my brain, terrible views, everything's bad, but it's easy watching. And they had a segment about toxic friendships. And I remember I tweeted saying something like, not friendships, but my getting away from my narcissistic mother and siblings has made me 10 times happier or something. And my brother shared it to his Facebook and wrote #projecting. My sister also wrote something similar to that on it. And then all of their friends chimed in to say that I was watching too much ITV, that I think my brother mocked me for having a made-up emotional instability disorder. And that was after I'd sent emails to my mum, like literally begging for her to acknowledge that I've had this diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, and I needed her to understand that I wasn't this like spoiled awful child she made me out to be. She had a part to play in it, and I needed her to take some responsibility, to which she never responded to. And there were other things in that thread. I remember seeing comments like about how I pose, how I flex too much in the mirror, and I've got duck lips. And ironically, this was before I started bodybuilding and got my lips done. So I'm like, come on, Hans, we've gone up a level from that. So, but I think I look back and it's like before this year, I was so afraid of even saying those things, like even saying that thing out loud to you there. That plays on a loop in my brain and has done for 10 years. going, oh my God, do I flex too much? Have I got a made up instability disorder? Am I projecting? Am I this horrible person that both my siblings and my mother say that I am, when all I've wanted to do is just have peace and be loved?
Yeah. That's what it boils down to, doesn't it? And it's funny that you say that things stick in your mind, because I was looking the other week and I've started wearing my hair with that mid-parting where it's in a tight bun at the back. And I said to Adam, I don't understand why I always feel like having my hair up doesn't suit me unless I've got it in like a bun, like a mum bun piled on my head. Why do I never wear it in a ponytail? Like when it was really, really long, or I had to like lean my head back. And I remembered, and this is the thing with trauma, once you start working through it, loads of stuff starts popping up for you and you're like, oh shit, that makes sense. I wish it didn't. But you start to remember lots of things. And I remember my mum saying to me, you look spiteful when you've got your hair up, when she was doing my hair once. And I was at my grandparents' house. My grandparents were dead before I was at secondary school. So no, my grandma was dead before I was at secondary school and Gran would have been alive. So I must have been really little. And that's subconsciously stuck with me and played on a loop. That drive and fear of never being good enough comes from all the times I've heard everything I've done for you, everything I've paid for your education, all the money I've wasted on you. And then down to like one of her favorite phrases, and I can't tell you how many times I've said to her, especially when she was living with us, you've got to stop saying it, because you only say it when you want to hurt me. And now I'm aware of that. It doesn't hurt me anymore, but my God, it makes me hate you. So stop saying it because it's hurtful. And she used to say to me, you're just like your father.
Oh, I used to get that phrase.
Yeah, but I was raised to believe that my dad was the worst human being to ever walk the earth. So for me, it was literally like saying, you are scum. It was her acceptable way of saying you are like scum. And it would be sort of, you're very like your father, if I did anything that was good business wise, because he was very good with business. So it became a backhanded compliment, as well as in a big argument, oh, you've got that spiteful little face just like your father. I can't imagine using my partner, or even if I wasn't with Adam and it was just, we'd separated, we'd had an awful separation and he was just the kid's dad. I can't imagine using him as a weapon against my children. That's just, to me, utterly baffling. But that was the kind of behavior you're dealing with. And it makes you question whether all these things that they're saying about you are the ones that are accurate. And I think when you grow up in that instability, you don't trust yourself.
No, not at all.
Who you are. It's always, and you don't even know who you are. You have to work it out. But it's always a case of trying to work out whether their version of you is the right one. Their version of you is real, and you've made everything up in your head.
And also understanding, are you thinking via their voice or are you thinking via your voice? Because I didn't realize for years after the estrangement, I thought in my mother and siblings' voices, and I thought it was a healthy thing to do I almost think 5 sentences ahead of myself now, so that I can protect myself from what that person is going to say back to me, and that I'm not going to fuck up. And even doing something like this is a huge healing step for me, because I'm trying not to be afraid of what I'm saying. Whereas before I'd almost PR train myself to be like, okay, if you dare say any of this out loud, they're going to come for you. Because I remember there was one time when I was in year 10, I think. And by this point I was at a state school, but I'd already gone through another private school where I'd been kicked out of for being too poor. So that was a whole other story. But this was my final high school when I was in year 10 or 11. I remember I had a full-blown breakdown. And in that year, there was quite a lot of a blackout. Like, I don't remember much of that year. And looking back, that's a big red flag. Like, because also I don't know if you have this trauma memory thing, but I can remember almost everything ever. I can remember what I was wearing on like August the 1st, 1999, like things like that I don't need in my brain, but that's why my trauma hangs on to it all. But I remember being in year 11 and I broke down completely, and I was in the art room with my art teacher, which all traumatized children did at school.
I did art.
See, do you go to there on your lunch breaks as well to hide?
Maybe.
Bingo.
Maybe.
It was either that, graphics, or resistant materials. One of those
shut
three.
up. Yeah, I did. I
Yeah.
actually spent so much, and I had a real kind of like connection with my art teacher.
Yeah.
And she had like a weird kind of, she was wonderful, and it wasn't in any way inappropriate. It was almost like a maternal instinct that was kept at a professional level.
Yeah.
But she was probably one of the only people that I really, really connected with on the staff, because everyone else, I really felt like I was butting against them in an authority way.
Yeah, I couldn't cope with authority at all. And I think that probably is the same for everyone who's gone through what we've gone through, because if your own mother treats you the way that how are you supposed to trust any other authority? It doesn't make sense. And often my mother was also against anything authority based. So it would be like if and now I understand that as because that would mean other people get too close to us. And so on that note, on both of those notes, I had this breakdown to my art teacher, and I remember she got me talking, and I spoke about how bad the relationship was between me and my sister, because my sister just did not like me. She never did. She was 7 when I was born. She was moved away from her home across the country to live somewhere else. And it all just coincided with I was this representation of this change in this family dynamic, and it was never supported. So of course there was that awful dynamic there. And so I'd broken down to my art teacher and basically said, this is happening, I can't cope at home, all of this is awful. And she called my mum and said, I think you need to deal with the situation between your daughters. And my mum turned up at the school, bollocked me for talking about the family unit outside of the family unit, and literally took me home and shut me in my room, and that was never spoken about again. And I remember I would go to my dad all the time and say, like, why is this not being done about this situation in our family home? And he'd just go, oh, well, it's just for an easy life. And it's like, whose life was easy? And the problem was I was such a, even though I would have the same thing as you, where I'd kind of kick back against authority, I was also a very easygoing, like safe child.
Yeah. Oh God, the easy kids.
Yeah.
Then, if you have children who just seem super easygoing, the good child.
Yeah.
The good child is quite often the child that is struggling,
yeah.
really struggling, because it's normal to test authority around the home. And I don't feel like I ever really did that around the home. I would do it at school, but I think that in itself is telling that I felt like I could do it at school. Like I felt like I could push back against the teachers, but not at home.
I think mine was a weird one, because I kind of could at home, but because I was so much younger than my siblings, it was just a really odd dynamic when I look back at it, and I'm still unpicking it now. And I think that's also important to note for anyone going through this, is even though I'm 10 years into this, I am still constantly unpicking this. Like, this will never leave me. These are things that, like I said, when I become a mum, that's all going to come back up again. Every single chapter of my life, every time I reach a new age, that's going to come back up for me in a different way. It's just, and going back to how you said about not understanding reality, when my dad died 10 years ago and I left my family home and went through that homelessness, and there was no stability, I had nothing. And exactly what you said, reality was what I struggled with. And that I remember saying it to multiple therapists, like, I don't know what reality is anymore. I don't know what is real. I have nothing to measure anything off. And if your own, and I've said it even to this day, when I'm overwhelmed, I'll say it. I'll get into a full-blown meltdown and I'll go, if your own mother doesn't love you, what's real? Because you're always told that that's real. And like one of the last conversations I had with my mum, I asked her if she even loved me, and she didn't say anything. And so when people say to me, like, oh, I'm sure she loves you, she's your mother, I can say, no, I literally asked her.
Yeah. I mean, she's literally told me, like,
yeah.
Her silence speaks volumes.
Yeah. And that leads us perfectly to, just as before we came on, we spoke briefly about silent treatment within family units. And when I put boundaries, I've only been able to learn to put boundaries in recently, because I used to think that silence was punishment.
Yes.
And that I couldn't use silence in any other ways. And when I say use silence, that's probably incorrect phrasing, but
you couldn't allow yourself to be silent, allow yourself to just sit with it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I felt like I constantly had to explain myself to counteract what that silence was when I was younger, because silence in my family unit meant you've done something wrong. The whole family unit's not going to talk to you now after we've had a shouting match first. We're then not going to talk to each other for at least 3 or 4 days, maybe a week. And then there's going to be a day where maybe someone goes, would you like this for dinner? And then everybody pretends, happened. Yep, like it never fucking happened. No apologies, no addressing of anything. And then lo and behold, a few weeks later, it happens again. Maybe it's a different family member we're icing out this time. Who knows? And so going into adulthood, I was probably then more vocal about absolutely everything and anything. So I was so afraid of thinking that silent treatment was going to be a punishment for people, and I didn't want other people to feel that. I wanted to make sure they knew that this is exactly what I was thinking, and even if you hurt me, I'm sorry, but I need to tell you why I'm doing this. And then I'd end up apologizing to the person that had hurt me. And so even with friendships, I've had a few things in the last couple of years where people have crossed so many boundaries, and I've learned that I don't have to give vocal boundaries all the time. I'm allowed to give unsaid boundaries that make it clear, whether it's body language, whether it's stepping back, whether it's taking it more time for me. I'm allowed to do that. I don't have to repeatedly explain everything's okay with our friendship. I'm taking some time for me. And I found that people aren't understanding that boundaries don't equate to silence punishment, if that makes sense. So it's a real difficult one, but I'm having to learn that I'm allowed to step back and just focus on myself without people thinking I'm punishing them.
Absolutely. And what we'd said just beforehand is how there's almost this attitude that, and I'd mentioned it in episode 1 of the podcast, that cutting a parent off is a form of abuse in itself. And you'd said a really good point there that links in with this about how that is because that parent, that person who feels that way, has always used silence or removing their presence as a form of punishment. This isn't punishment. This is seeking peace. Huge difference. This is setting a boundary in place. And I have a podcast lined up to talk specifically about boundaries because they're so misunderstood. And somebody had said something to me about all this setting boundaries that just shows you're a narcissist and all you want to do is have it your own way. And I'm like, well, somebody didn't read their boundary book, because that's so not what this means. Boundaries is not about controlling others. No, it's not about saying to my mum, you can't do that. You can't come in and sit at our dining table, eat a meal that I've cooked you, tell me that it's bad, and then make homophobic or racist comments whilst my children sit there and everybody eats in silence because we're so uncomfortable. I'm not saying you can't do that. You have the power to decide whether you do that or not. I'm saying to you that won't be tolerated by me because it crosses my boundary. So if you choose to do that because that's your choice, then I will not allow you to come over to this space again. That's the boundary. The boundary is only ever what's within your control. So when we are cutting off a parent, or when we are saying, okay, no, I just need to step back a bit, even if we're not verbalizing I need to step back a bit, even if you've not sat down with a parent and said, I'm cutting you off because of this, we've made it perfectly clear in the past what we will and won't tolerate. That's not a form of abuse. That's not using silent treatment. That's saying, this is the boundary, which is quite obvious. If you behave in that way, I'm not going to tolerate it.
Absolutely. And I think it's I'm really excited for that episode, by the way, just to
I think it'd be useful for a lot of people. Yes. Yeah, I think it'd be helpful.
So much. And it's also something to add to that is, as I've gone through my recovery with therapy and understanding, like I use exercise as therapy, and I've really learned how to make my body mine again and feel like I'm in control of it. And what I've realized is that trauma is very much your brain has been disconnected from your body. Right. What we were taught when we were younger was not to trust our own brains, not to trust our own bodies, and everybody else knows best about absolutely everything. We don't know best. And as I've gone through my trauma recovery, and I've gone through whether it's using exercise as therapy, or it's actual therapy, or it's, I don't know, reflexology, chiropractic, everything, I've realized that healing trauma is getting the brain to meet the body once more.
Yes.
And you feel so whole in that connection of trusting yourself and being so competent in your own decisions that you don't need to look for external validation. You don't have that pang of, oh my God, if I had a mum, I might know what I'm doing because they might actually be able to help me and I can't do this. You start to learn, my brain's in my body. and I am making a confident decision, and that is the end of that thought process. And the same thing happens with boundaries, is that when we have finally met our brains with our bodies and we've learnt that we feel whole there, I'm going to protect that with my whole damn life. Like, I'm not sacrificing that wholeness again for anything. So those boundaries that I put in, whether it's with family, whether it's with friendships, the reason why that is is because I know how painful it is to disconnect from myself again. And I won't abandon my younger self in the same way that I was abandoned. And I refuse to do that. And if people don't understand that, that's absolutely fine. It's not my responsibility to explain to them what I need to do for my life and my health and my safety and my peace. They can have whatever narrative they want about me. But now that I've made that true link and that connection and come back to my whole self and my boundaries I'm confident in, it's so powerful. And I think you've reached that point as well. And we will both waver occasionally, and you'll have those wobbly moments where you need a parent and you need something. But when you find that wholeness and those boundaries, it's actually no wonder that other people don't understand boundaries, because so many people are disconnected from themselves with or without trauma.
Yeah, so true. And I think once you start setting boundaries and once you start self-validating and being able to sit there and say, actually, no, how do I feel about this? How is this impacting me? Am I in a good space? Am I okay? And checking in with yourself. You can't stop, and you start to demand so much better from everything around you. You know, for me, I'm only 3 years into estrangement, or coming up to 3 years in June. But in between that phase of cutting ties with my mum and now, I feel like I've had a real breakdown. And it's allowed me to come to this space now where I feel, and my therapist actually said this to me the other week, and I was like, oh, I feel like I've got a gold star. And she said to me, I feel like it's slotted into place with you now, and you are in such a confident, better space where you can, what's the word, where you are sort of backing yourself, where you're self-validating, where you are coming through for yourself and actually showing up for you. Because when you deal with a narcissist, or when you deal with somebody who is toxic, especially as a child, you learn to self-abandon.
Yeah. I completely sacrificed myself.
Completely.
And that's actually, interestingly, just brought me to another point that I wanted to discuss, where when we look at the generational thing, our parents' trajectory of life was very much one linear track of, you go to school, you go to college, you go to uni, you get a job, you have your children, you have your husband, you do that one job for the rest of your life, and then you probably retire, have a nice retirement, you've got your house that you've bought, done. So even though my family life wasn't like that, because at various points we had no money, and at one point we slept on the floor of my dad's office for like 3 weeks because we couldn't afford a home. Like, there's all these things that I look back and I'm like, oh, that's not a funny dinner party anecdote, that was trauma. So anyway, that aside, the reason why I'm saying this, and that trajectory, and that expectance of them to have children, that's why there's so much resentment, I find, with that boomer millennial link, because not only were boomers just expected to have kids, and they were taught to sacrifice themselves, and that sacrifice was where their identity lay. So our identity lay in value, theirs lay in sacrifice. And so as we've got older and millennials have gone, my value is based on my career and what I do, therefore I will probably have children later. And we start to realize that maybe we want to be a bit more healthy before we have children, or maybe we don't want them at all. We exercise our autonomy, and that's what boomers didn't tend to do. So there is that deep resentment, and that's why it comes through with the, I did this for you, I sacrificed this for you, because they were taught that that's how to show love in the most fucked up way, which doesn't actually mean they love you, just to caveat that. But there's so many nuances here, which, when you remove yourself objectively, and don't get me wrong, I'm massively privileged to have been able to do this because I'm 10 years into an estrangement, and my life now has absolutely, there's no connections in my life now, or like this house I'm in, my family have never been to it. They don't know any of my friends. They don't know any of, I'm an entirely different human being now to the person I was when I was then. So I'm very safe in what I do. But with that, there is that privilege of being able to step back and objectively observe my childhood almost as if it was like a TV show that I'm just picking apart. And so when you get to that point, that's where a lot of your healing will really start to cement itself, because when I was in the throes of it, I wasn't able to validate myself because I was still that person. And it's very hard to validate the same version of yourself because you've been taught that you're attention seeking and you're selfish and you're spoiled. And like you said, how people come through and they say, you just want it your own way.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're older and you can look back and I can go, right, 33-year-old version of me says 23-year-old me, if she was here now, I'd give her a cuddle and go, fuck yeah, you're doing really well. And I cannot believe that you are still alive.
Like, just high five for ticking along, because that's enough. And that's impressive considering what you went through. I just want to veer off slightly, because you mentioned that your estrangement happened after your dad passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a particularly close relationship with your dad? And how do you, looking back at it now, you mentioned that he would often say, oh, it's just for an easy life. And I hear that so much from people that talk about, and that, because for me, it was just me and my mum. But it's almost like a form of enabling.
Oh, yeah.
And
100%.
How do you look back at him and your experience with him?
So this is a very interesting one, because we romanticize the dead. So I'm always very careful of my opinion. My viewpoint of him sits firmly on that of a child with a father and at a young age. So like, I don't know how my relationship would have been with him now. We clashed quite a bit over the years, but we were also very, very close. And we didn't clash in the same way that me and my mum did. We clashed in probably quite a stereotypical teenage daughter causing havoc and father way. But he taught me a lot in terms of, he taught me that I'm allowed to quit things. He taught me that I'm allowed to be self-employed. He would do things like, I was at Southampton Uni and I was only there for 3 months, but I was 5-hour drive away from home and I was wildly homesick. And I remember calling my mum and she just said, I don't know what you want me to do. You're too far away, which I was kind of like, that's kind of the point. And my dad got in the car and drove to me and picked me up. So like, that shows the difference in what they would meet me with. Whereas, and this is where the dynamic is a weird one, because I was very close to my dad, but not in like I don't know how to explain it. Like, we just sort of got each other and it was never really forced. And we did really nice things. Like, he took me to my first football match when I was in like, I think it was like 2006. And it was just little things like we'd go to air shows together, or he used to rally drive. So I'd go and watch him rallying. And there's like one of the only pictures I've got with him is us at Silverstone when I was like 4. So he was kind of an eternal child. And I don't think he was necessarily a very good husband. So that's where the dynamics were difficult, because I would get told certain things about, I would have basically everyone in the family unit would be slagged off at one point or another by somebody. So there was this constant push-pull. There was no sort of, like, I don't know who was in the right and who was in the wrong half the time. This is not me pushing blame onto anyone, because I didn't really understand it. And basically when he was dying, he had bowel cancer from when I was 17. He got it when I was 17 first, and then he was nearly in remission for 5 years, and then he got misdiagnosed twice because they told him he had a stomach bug, sent him home. Then they went to hospital, they told him he had constipation, sent him home with laxatives. Then he went into hospital to have keyhole surgery because they thought he had adhesions, so like lumps of scar tissue on the old surgery where they'd removed the cancer before. And they went in and they saw a load of tumors and they just went, oh no, off you go home to die now. And they literally just abandoned him. So that would have been when I was 21, 22, and seeing him gradually decline it was awful, but it meant I was the only emotional one in the family, right? So I instinctively was very good at death, but also that's where it's really fucked up, because all of my grandparents died when I was young. My auntie died when I was 12. My like most of my family died like under the age of 60 or like when I was young. And so I think that's also where it's brought me a whole other perspective on with the estrangement. It was kind of like, I've experienced so much death that I know that if I allow myself to live a substandard life, I won't, I will be sad. And I'm like, I could literally die real soon. So let's go and try and do something nicer.
Yeah.
But when Dad was dying, we had some incredible conversations, and I've spoken about it on other podcasts, but we had some amazing conversations about how he felt about dying and how he even said to me himself, we didn't talk enough, did we? But then as he got less and less in terms of the emotional barrier, so he wasn't an emotional man himself, but I think he met my needs in the way I needed them to be met. But I realized he picked up the emotional slack from my mum. Also, he would kind of shut down any issues, which isn't healthy, but that's why it never became something bigger and the estrangement never happened sooner, because I'd fall out with my mum and he'd sort of go sort things out with your mother, and then that would kind of be it. Whereas obviously then as he was dying and he couldn't do that anymore, that's how things became this like bubbling pot. And then from my understanding and how I've looked at it all objectively since, my mum potentially had quite a lot of jealousy towards my relationship with my dad, and I think my sister did as well. And I think there was a lot of unspoken feelings that I didn't understand, and I think that's also why I'm very sensitive to people saying that they're jealous of me now, because a lot of people will say things off the cuff like, oh, I'm so jealous that you've done this thing, or you're so brave, I'm so jealous that you're able. Whereas to me, I see that as soon as someone is jealous of me, or I've had to work really hard not to be afraid of doing well at something, because it will always be met with disdain and anger and jealousy from somebody in my direct safe unit, which wasn't safe. And so I think as soon as the penny started to drop that my mum couldn't meet my emotional needs, and if anything, my dad was masking that she was like negative in the emotional needs department, I just had to save myself. And again, I've spoken about it recently, the actual details of it, but in a nutshell, I wasn't allowed to do a reading at my dad's funeral. I was told that the adults had to do it, but I was 23, and so it's kind of like, but at the same time I was deemed a child in certain circumstances where I wasn't told about certain things in the family, or I was expected to be left out of stuff like the speeches. But then I was also expected to be an adult in the sense that I was supposed to manage my own emotions and look after myself. So there was a constant mixed signal going on.
Which is so hard to navigate.
Awful.
Impossible to navigate.
Yeah, and that's also another reason why I didn't know myself, and didn't trust myself, because I didn't know who I was meant to be, and I had no guidance and I had no support. I just had constant criticism and constant negativity. And then when it came to the funeral itself, I remember my partner was asked to be a pallbearer. He was younger than me as well, and there was always a narrative pushed around the fact that he was not good for me, when actually it was that I met him and he encouraged me to talk. And anyway, and that's another podcast for another day. But and then there was no space for me in the car that they all went in to the funeral. And so I drove myself. I wore a blue bowler hat and I wore a really nice dress. And I was like, I'm going to hold my own here. They stood apart from me at the funeral. So I was standing on the other side with my auntie and my uncle, who had also been estranged from the family for years.
Wow.
And there was so much estrangement in the past as well from both sides of the family. So you can see where the patterns have just trickled down. And then I wasn't spoken to at the wake at all, even though it was in my own house. I was so fortunate that I had my friends with me who had come from uni, even though they hadn't met my dad. And then the next morning, my mum and my siblings went off for breakfast, and it was only my brother's girlfriend that turned around to me and said, are you coming for breakfast? And she was fairly new to the family, and I said, nobody has asked me. And they all went and got in the car silently and drove off, and my friends just looked at me and were like, is it normally like this? And I was like, ha ha ha, yeah. And they're like, maybe not good. And I was like, oh. And it was like the biggest other shoe dropping. And in that literally split second, I had a choice in that exact minute. And I remember where I was this day. I could either sit there and stay and do what my dad did and say to look after my mum and this, that, and the other, or I could pack my bags, drive back to my flat, because I was still at uni in Nottingham, I had a few months left on the lease. I could pack as much as I could into my car, and I got out of there. And I didn't go back. My partner tried to go back a year. Well, we tried to sort of resolve things over about a year after, because over that course of that next year, my uncle then died 6 months later, and then my auntie died 3 years later as well. So there was a lot of death. I think my dad's cousin had died as well. So there was just so many funerals, so many situations where I would then encounter them again. And I tried really hard to hang on to that connection, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I got to a point where I was so worn down, and I was so beaten by all the nastiness and all the nasty words that were said about me, that I thought I was evil, and I thought I was bad, and I thought I was this awful person that no one should ever be around. And I'm nearly crying saying this.
Yeah, no, I can say it's such a hard memory to work through, though.
Yeah, and it's that understanding of reality, and I think I never will understand the full reality around that. But what I do know is that I made the right choice for me, and I will never ever regret that. And yeah, after that, ended up bouncing around various friends' family homes for a few years, sort of begging for help because I didn't have any money. And then I managed to set up my first business, moved into my own place, and my best friend and my partner went over to my mum's house with a man with a van, bin bagged everything they possibly could of mine, and chucked it into a van and brought it to my new house, and that was that. Yeah. So
this is the thing, you know, that baffles me when people don't grasp estrangement. Like, listening to that, I have never spoken to anybody or come across anybody who would choose to become estranged and to go through that traumatic experience of being homeless, of completely ostracizing themselves from their family, from what the only thing they've known, to completely step away from it all out of spite, or because they weren't getting their own way, or to have a bit of a temper tantrum. It's just nobody is doing that. It is literally a difference of, if I continue this way, what is going to be left of me? What is my path? Where the hell do I see this going? Who will I be in 5 years' time if I stay, if I allow this relationship to continue, if I stick in this position where I am being treated this way, where what you've described there is classic scapegoat within a toxic family dynamic.
Oh, yeah.
If I stay this scapegoat, if I stay in this position, will I even be here in 5, 6, 7, 10 years' time? Or is this going to slowly kill me? Because that's what it would do.
Exactly. And even full transparency, after that scenario, I attempted to unalive myself 3 times over the course of the next 5 years after that. And I that's the thing I think people don't understand, is when they say to me like, oh, but she's your mother and this, that, and the other, I'm like, I didn't want that. I didn't want to spend my first 2 Christmases after my dad sitting on my own. I didn't want to spend those birthdays without anyone. I am crying. Hello, therapy. I didn't want that. I wanted my mom. Like, I wanted my family. And I didn't want to have to leave my dogs behind. Like, that broke me. And so I think these are the things that people don't see. Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine, because it's real, because it's accurate and true.
Yeah.
And it's the reality of it. Nobody wants that. And I've said so many times when I've talked about my estrangement from my mum, I went to speak to her to ask her to leave our annex with a full plan that would set her up financially and allow us to have a low contact relationship. And her attitude was essentially, if I can't have it my way, and she's even said to me before, I'm going to hit you where it hurts and destroy you. And I think, you know, there's so much missed within the estrangement conversation that literally nobody wants to be in this position. It is the shittiest thing.
Yeah.
And it's, do you see, with you saying I didn't want to spend my birthdays alone or without those birthday cards, without those things, it's, if you can put yourself in the position of feeling that fear when you do get a birthday card or when you do get some kind of contact from them, if you have that healthy dynamic, and you flip it to where contact from them is a source of fear, is something that can literally make your palms sweat, make your pulse race, because that's how negatively you feel about it, then surely you can understand that that is not a healthy situation to stay in. You are stuck in a trauma, and the only way to remove yourself from it is to literally physically remove yourself from it.
Yeah, and I think there's two types of representations we see online of estrangement. And one is the you and me who are really powerful in our healing and confident now in our decisions. And essentially we're well on our journey. We're not in the throes of it. But then the other side you see is how I started speaking about it when I was first estranged, and you'd sort of have I was 23 and I'd have a big wobble online of like, oh my God, this is happening, blah, blah, blah. And so there's two distinctions. Nobody sees the pain in that. They see difficult child causing drama. They don't see this person is really, really, really sad and considering ending their life because they just want a mum. And also essentially both my parents died at the same time. Like but the difference is I'm having to grieve a parent that's still alive. And say, for example, like my cousins lost their parents 3 years after my dad died. So like I said, their dad died 6 months after mine, and then their mum died 3 years later. So it's been interesting looking at the dynamic of that, because both of their parents died. And so therefore there was a lot of care and empathy, obviously, because there fucking should be. But because mine also both died, but because just my dad died, and then my mum is technically still alive, I was treated by society in such a different way, when realistically on paper both things happened to both people. They both lost their parents, and neither one is better or worse than the other, because both are fucking awful. But it was just so interesting to see how people really don't understand estrangement. And I think that's why I've been careful about how I've spoken about it for my own sake, because I've had to protect myself, because I'm still very afraid of what will come from things like this. But I'm starting to speak out more because I know that I needed this. I needed to hear these stories when I was younger. I needed people like you and me who on paper, if we never spoke about this, on paper we could look like we were having the easiest fucking lives. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, but to me the hard-hitting stories don't help me, because I don't relate to hard-hitting, because that feels so emotionally distant. So you know how like we can read news articles of someone being murdered and we're just like, okay, on with my day. Whereas
there's a psychological link there between trauma and how it helps you. So a lot of people who work in nurses, who work as paramedics, they see such trauma, their brains process it differently. So it's actually, it alters your brain chemistry, does trauma. And that's why we can look at stuff. Like I can read some stuff. I remember the only time I've ever been truly affected, it was when a little girl it was on the TV and they showed it on the news. God knows why. I'd not long given birth. And this news article came on where this little girl, I think it was in China. She'd been hit by a car, but they showed the video clip of it. And then someone else drove over her, because that's how cheap and ambivalent, that's how cheap life was and how ambivalent it was. And that was what they were highlighting, was this is the crisis, the humanitarian crisis going on here. And I remember screaming, why is that on the TV? Why are you letting me see that? First time I'd ever reacted to anything like that. And it was all the hormones of having just given birth. And my mum just looked at me and was like, what is wrong with such disdain of what is wrong with you? I think you're having a breakdown. How many times do you get told you're having a breakdown if you express any kind of emotion?
Yeah.
And I suppose in a way, it just really affected me, but it shocked me so much that I had a response to it, because I never really had. And I don't think you do have responses to trauma when you've lived in it.
And that's why, for me, it's been really important to present it in such a gentle, everyday way. Because for me, as a trauma survivor,
I always feel really uncomfortable with that as well. I'm abuse victim or trauma survivor. I'm like, but they're both accurate.
Yeah, because I don't feel comfortable saying them, because I feel like I have so much fear around people telling me that I'm wrong and that I've imagined it all and that I've made it all up and that actually I'm just difficult. So that's my own issue, though. That's something that I need to deal with.
It's the same issue for a lot of people, though. It really is. And I get it quite a lot, where somebody said to me the other day, you're a classic case for BPD. And I was like, well, I mean, I've asked my therapist, and actually, no, I'm not.
But also,
but
it's just fucking trauma.
But it was
stigmatizing.
Yeah, it is. And then she'd said, you're a sociopath. And I was like, you're going to have to pick a condition at this point, hun. And then she said I was a liar. And I was like, but you understand BPD is trauma. You've just told me that I'm lying about my trauma. So which are we just flinging out insults? Because if we're just using mental health conditions to fling out insults, that's really telling about you and says nothing about me. My trauma is just as valid, and it doesn't have to be physical or sexual abuse for it to be valid. Emotional abuse is so damaging.
And that's been the hardest thing for me, to feel like I'm allowed to talk about it, because obviously for so long emotions and emotional abuse was just not seen as a thing.
Yeah.
And so, like, I even remember when I was younger, there was a thing on Radio 4 when I was probably in my teens about emotional abuse, and I didn't listen to Radio 4, my parents did. And I remember my mum sort of jokingly saying to my dad, sounds like what you do to me. And everything was just like, haha, very funny, on we go. And it's like, I look back and it's like, now I've got that perspective, I don't feel, I don't know what word I feel, but I look at it and I think there's so many of us in that unit that could have been saved by just being heard. And I think that's why I'm allowing myself to process anger now, because you'll probably relate to this. I thought I was a really anxious person for a long time, but it turned out that it's not been acceptable for us to be angry, because when we're angry, people tell us that weakens you're looking at me smirking. When you're angry, people tell you that weakens like your argument, or like, I won't listen to you when you're doing this. So my anger started presenting as anxiety, because people, and this was a real subconscious thing, I've literally only learned this in like the last month, where my anxiety was more palpable, it was more digestible for people. So it was, people would stop for a second, and don't get me wrong, I was still misunderstood with it, and I was still told to calm down and cheer up. But if I was angry, like, my mum went around telling people that she was scared of me, and that's why she didn't bother having anything to do with me.
My mum did.
So and so I think from knowing that your own mum says you're scary, and literally telling people that, and that's the reason for the estrangement, was because I was scary, then I learned from that I wasn't allowed to be angry, because anger meant that I would be blamed, and I would be told that I was bad and evil and wrong and all these other things. So that anxiety came through, and now I'm allowing myself to process that anger. It's been phenomenally liberating, but it's also meant that I'm no longer angry towards them, because I'm letting that anger just be alive in me and kind of embracing it.
It absolutely makes sense. It really does. I can feel sometimes when I have anger.
Yeah.
And I
shove it down.
Feel it, but and I have to physically take a deep breath and start to disassociate. Because sometimes I feel like if I just take the lid off the anger, and I remember having a massive row with Adam once, and he'd just been like, just say it, say everything you want to say, get it out, let it go. And I couldn't stop. Once I started, I couldn't stop. And then I couldn't remember what I was saying word to word, because I was completely disassociating as I was speaking. And there was so much rage there that I felt like if I really let the lid off it, I'd never get the lid back on. And I think sometimes that's what bubbles up as the anxiety surrounding your feelings of estrangement. And I spoke to somebody called Abby Williams, who does You the Mother, and she is a therapist. She was saying about the concept of forgiveness, and how she absolutely does not agree that forgiveness is something you have to give in order for you to heal. No, you don't have to forgive anything. Nope. You have to be able to process it, and you have to be able to look at it objectively, but you don't have to forgive it to say you've healed. That's bullshit. And it is bullshit. You are allowed to feel those feelings of anger. You're allowed to look at it and go, that was really unfair. What we have to do with that anger and with those feelings of that was really unfair, that's really hurt me, is not allow it to control us. We control it. We allow it to be, but we're not letting it control us.
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing there that I took from what you were saying is that, from my own personal experience, I used to feel like I had to force forgiveness, and like I was doing something wrong if I couldn't access this part of me to forgive these people that did such awful things. And it's only just occurred to me that it's not that I have forgiven them or haven't. I just don't care anymore about whether I do. And that for me is where the closure starts to come in, because that's what I think people misunderstand what forgiveness actually is. Because I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about attention seeking and attention being packaged in different ways. Forgiveness is also packaged in different ways. We're taught that everything is just one thing, has a definition, is this, and people think that forgiveness is going along to your parents and saying, oh, I'm so sorry, let's make friends. And actually like that's just never going to happen, because it just isn't. Like, I've come to terms with that a long time ago. I'm fine with that, whatever. But with forgiveness, I think sometimes it naturally, you can't force it. That's the first thing I've learned. So it doesn't matter how many fucking people tell you, you've got to forgive these people, make you feel better. That's very annoying. That's probably going to push me back a year. I'm going to add on every time someone tells me to forgive. I'm deliberately not going to do it for another year.
It's just annoying. It has zero purpose to tell someone to forgive or to move on or any of these things. Zero purpose. It does nothing. It's like when you say to somebody who's in a full temper, calm down.
Oh, don't. That is like waving a fucking red flag.
In the history of ever. That's never worked.
I literally say this to people, and when people tell me to smile. I had a situation not that long ago, just to go off on a tangent for a second. I was doing a workshop for a boxing thing, and it was just me and a bunch of, it wasn't even boxing, it was a weightlifting course I was doing, and one of the lads, it was just me and a load of men. One of them decided that he needed to tell me to smile whilst I was lifting weights, and I just looked at him dead in the eyes and went, have you ever told a woman to smile and it's worked? And do you know what? Follow that sentence after anyone telling you to smile, chill, calm down, they don't know what to do.
No, they don't. I said it to Ruben last night. Ruben went, calm down. I went, Ruben, have you ever said to anybody, calm down, and known it actually work? Or does it not just piss you off? Like, if I say to you, when you're really angry with me, Ruben, and I say to you, calm down, does it not just piss you off? And he like looks at me and he was like, fair point, Mum. Fair point. I mean, he's nearly 12, but he was just like, fair point, Mum. So
that's 12 is exactly the age you need to be having these conversations.
Yeah, because then he won't bloody well tell me to calm down, because I
don't need to calm down. We need to be angry, guys. Come on.
It's never helped anyone telling them to calm down. It's never going to help.
Honestly, this conversation has just been so freeing. Thank you.
No, thank you for taking the time to come on and talk to us. I know I've said before, when I've recorded podcast episodes about this, it's a really heavy topic.
Yeah, really heavy.
It is heavy. And I never used to understand that term. I used to be like, heavy. Okay, don't get it. But it is a really heavy topic. It weighs on you. And my goal with this podcast is that if I can help somebody who was going through what I was going through, because I really was alone, it shattered my marriage, it shattered my life, it shattered everything. When we got to that point where I had to make a decision to cut ties, it destroyed everything. And I was so alone in it, whilst trying to keep things going for these 3 kids of my own. And I just remember feeling like I was the only person in the world that was going through this. And you are never the only person. No. You are never the freak, the weirdo, the oddball, the person causing the problem when you're going through these things. That's just not right. But it is the lie that we're sold about it, because we shroud it in shame by keeping it completely silent. And that's what I want to do, is break that silence surrounding it and let people know that they're not alone.
Oh, I love that. And something I learned recently to kind of add on to that is that our ego is what covers the shadow self. And so often we can find that we're too afraid to tell people what's going on, because our ego is saying, if we tell people, they might think that you're the problem, or they might judge you for not having a perfect family unit, or whatever judgment arises. And so when we learn that our ego is often what's protecting our healing, it helps me to lose that ego, because I was brought up in such an egotistical environment where everything, and I don't even mean that in like a classic egotistical way, I just mean everyone's egos were just so heightened and switched on and in fear of anyone ever looking anything other than perfect. And so as now a recovering people pleaser and a recovering perfectionist and all of these things, I just wanted to add to that you're allowed to let that ego just go sometimes and not be. I was so adamant for years that I needed everybody to understand exactly how I felt and be on my side and be on my team and not let them win. And it's not until you stop trying to get people on your side and you stop caring about who wins, that's when the healing begins, when you stop caring about who wins this.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, with estrangement, and it is a sad fact, I don't think there's any winners. I think the only win that you can have is your peace.
Yes.
The only win that you can have is knowing that you've done the right thing for you. And if they feel the same on the other side of it, feeling that they're the ones in the right, and that's a win for them, that's okay. That's got nothing to do with you. And that's what it boils down to, because there's no winners when you're talking about toxic family dynamics. It is an all-round shitty situation, but the real win is in protecting your peace and knowing that you've done what's right for you.
Yeah, and not ignoring that child self.
Yeah.
Keep loving her.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that inner child. It's going back and reparenting yourself and being able to say, hey, look, we are okay. We've made it here. We've already lived through the worst of what we could. We're okay.
Yeah, we can do anything except for answer phone calls to strangers. Don't like that.
Yeah, no, that one's not keen on that one. Not keen on that one at all. And I mean, like we said beforehand, sometimes we like to rely on having a bit of quartz in our back pocket, because it's before we came on the call, we were like, we've got some really weird quirks that we've like picked up. Like I showed you a crystal. I was like, look, I've got into crystals. It's a new thing. It's like in the last week, but I kind of just like looking at them and like a fidget ring. And you were like, I have a quartz. Yay.
Oh no, it's a slippery slope. I've got a whole bag of them that I take with me everywhere. And I'm like, this one is for my abundance. This one is for my safety. And I'm like,
but if you'd have asked me like 5 years ago, I'd have been like, it's fucking weird, man. I'm not a crystal girly. That's like,
welcome.
No, I'm far too logical. But now I'm like, oh, crystal. They're pretty
come
tiny.
on. Do we have any logic left? We've just been through a pandemic. There's a war. Everything is bad. Look, if all we have is crystals, that's what I'm turning to now.
Exactly. I feel like the millennial generation could be the generation that is just like, do you know what? Fuck it. Anything we can find a little bit of joy in, because we've lived through, podcast, crystals, tarot cards, bring them all in. Because frankly, we've lived through pandemics, we've lived through recessions. Every fucking year is a crisis.
A perma crisis. I'm literally
a perma crisis.
I think that's why I've just got to the point now where I've just given myself so much room to feel, because I'm like, literally nothing's real anymore, so it's fine.
Yeah, we're not millennials anymore, we're just a crisis generation.
If they don't call us that in history GCSEs in the future, I'm going to be pissed off and I'm going to haunt someone until they do.
Exactly. I'm going to be telling my grandchildren, I'll be like, look guys, I don't care what your history book says.
Crisis.
Millennial, we're the crisis generation. My kids are going to look at me and be like, you were basically Wonder Woman. How did you ever manage to survive it all? I don't know.
Like, I didn't. I'm haunting you.
Yes,
anyway.
I'm haunting you. But can you let people know where they can find you, please?
Nice and simple. It's just at Elspeth Fit, FIT, because as I mentioned at the start, I am also a fitness coach and do a lot around exercise therapy. So it's at Elspeth Fit on both TikTok and Instagram. And from there, you can kind of find any other links and whatnot. Kept it nice and simple.
Amazing. That's fab. And I will put a link for that in the bio. And as always, guys, thank you so much for listening. Elspeth, thank you so much for your time today and for coming and talking on the podcast and sharing your experience with us, because I know it's going to be something that will resonate with so many people.
Thank you so much. Honestly, yeah, it's just, it's like you said, it's heavy, but hopefully it helps.
That's the goal. So we will speak to you again next week, guys. And thank you, as always, for listening. I've been Harriet Shearsmith, and together we are Unfollowing Mum.